So welcome. Today we are going to talk about the concept of person in position of trust. I will try to make this relevant to everybody, but being from the NHS, there is a natural leaning towards that organisation. I'm currently the Associate Director for Safeguarding for the Isle of Wight NHS Trust and Portsmouth University Hospital Trust, and my background is adult safeguarding. As I approached this presentation, I thought I would reflect for a moment as to my journey into where I am now, to share with you who I am so you can understand where I'm coming from. And this slide took on a little bit of a life of its own, if I'm honest, because I started to think about my journey to being into safeguarding, and then some of the key bits of safeguarding activity nationally that have really guided my perception around person in position of trust. So I won't linger too long, but just to share with you, I'm a physiotherapist by background, and I trained and qualified in 1998. I regularly share with people that was before the internet, and I remember Google being released and thinking that would never take off. It was before smartphones and before we lived our lives in social media. I worked in Sheffield. My first job was at the Northern General, which at the time was the biggest NHS trust in the country. I worked extensively in sport, and I have toured with multiple rugby teams across Europe. I travelled through Australia, and in 2003, I ran away from South Yorkshire and found myself here on the Isle of Wight. Needless to say, very quickly, I found myself with another rugby team and working as their physiotherapist. I left my clinical role as physiotherapy for the first time in 2012. And that is when I first got exposed to safeguarding. This was pre-Care Act, when really safeguarding was something that was a nice to do, not a must do. But we very quickly started seeing very large scale reviews, such as Winterbourne and Mid-Staffs, where staff members and people in caring positions were the perpetrators of significant abuse. Took a little bit of a break in my career. My two children are on the screen. They don't look like that now, and they won't forgive me for sharing those pictures either. And interestingly, the first freedom to speak up policy in the NHS didn't come out until 2015. I entered adult safeguarding substantively in 2015, and the rest, as they say, is history. But reflecting on my journey today, I do wonder whether my journey into safeguarding would have been different if discrimination and misogyny were talked about as much then as they are now. And I reflect on some of the things I experienced and witnessed in my sporting profession as a physiotherapist that actually probably weren't okay in the male-dominated world. So it's made me really reflect as to how I come to this position. I think what we should do to start with is really dive into the concept of what a position of trust is before we really talk about how we should be managing it and some considerations. So a position of trust is really anybody that within their world, within their role in society or employment, can hold a position to exercise authority, power or control over an adult or child. Now, that isn't just limited to people that work for recognised organisations such as the NHS or the local authority. These can be people that are sports coaches, they can be people from religious organisations, or they can be celebrities. I think we must be clear that if a person has behaved in a way that has placed an adult with care and support needs at risk, the statutory response is from the local authority. Safety of children is absolutely paramount. If somebody has behaved towards a child that has put them at risk of harm, we must safeguard that child, and we must consider involvement of our statutory agencies such as the police and local authority. But for today, I just want to dive into some of the concepts that we must consider around position of trust. What are those concerns? How do we assess them as leaders or employers or working in organisations? And what can we do to learn and progress and respond? Bear with me while I first dive into the concept of celebrity in a position of trust, as I think it's really important to consider how the world we work in now impacts and imposes on the way in which our children, young people and adults behave in society. Now, some of those faces on the screen in front of you are some of the most prolific cases that we've seen in recent years. We've got football coach who's serving 34 years for child sex offences. We've got along the top Bill Cosby, R. Kelly, Al Fayed, that is just falling apart in the national media at the moment, right the way through to Weinstein, and probably one of the most famous abuses of trust, which would be Jimmy Savile, which is a lot of where this concept started. And don't get me started, I guess, on the influence of the Tate brothers into modern society and how that is playing out as well. In all of these cases, these people used their position to access those people that they abused, but they also used their position to silence those that could have done something about it. Whether that was silence them by people turning a blind eye, or whether it was because they were coercing those around that were seeing things into believing that this wasn't what they were seeing, that this couldn't possibly be that person, that celebrity doing these things. And I think in some of these cases, there is a definite level of fear around whether to whistleblow or not. What about me? It's a natural human instinct to consider what are the implications for me if I speak out. But the Bishard inquiry, and that goes back to 2004, really told us quite clearly it is our task to make it as difficult as possible for these people to succeed. It took me a moment to then think about 2004, 20 years ago, and has that really been embedded in what we're seeing now? I think I would say no. In many cases, that concept hasn't been embedded. More recent cases, both regionally and nationally, are saying that those people that are blowing the whistle aren't being listened to. Those people that are raising concerns are feeling marginalised, are being told not to further report, not to escalate. I even read in the news this morning around the Thirlwall inquiry, and one of the paediatricians saying that we had concerns, but they weren't listened to. There is institutional neglect of responsibility to call out misogynistic, racist, toxic behaviour. So in all of these cases, there is a weakness in response. So what is it we should be doing to make it difficult, make it as difficult as possible? Every organisation should have a positive reporting culture, and we should have an absolute zero tolerance to these behaviours. Now, when I say zero tolerance, I absolutely mean that. And I will share with you a challenge that I received when I described my zero tolerance to domestic abuse. And I was told that was pie in the sky. We could never ever get rid of domestic abuse. So I really shouldn't worry about zero tolerance because that was unrealistic. And my challenge back was, which bit of domestic abuse should I tolerate? The bit on a Friday night, the bit that is not visible, the bit that goes on behind closed doors, the bit that actually is only, I should only tolerate the bit with a weapon or not, the bruise or the cut, which bit? That conversation ended in somebody agreeing with me that they should have a zero tolerance, whether it was an unreasonable expectation or not. They would then actively challenge, because their belief was nothing should be tolerated. And it was a really positive outcome. So I encourage us all to have a zero tolerance. And there is a really big difference between being non-discriminatory and anti-discriminatory. I don't discriminate. Or am I anti-discriminatory when I call it out, that I challenge it? And there's a difference between those two kinds of concepts. So to dive a little bit more, having understood a position of trust, but what is a person in position of trust concern? I want to highlight some of the language on the screen now. Any form of abuse, which indicates rather than which proves. And the word may, which indicates they may be unsuitable. Not that they are or are not, but it gives you the may. It is possibility. But let's be clear about our threshold for that. As leaders in organisations, we simply need reasonable cause to believe. We don't have to know beyond all reasonable doubt that these concerns are real. We have to have reasonable cause to believe, which means that any other reasonable person, given the same evidence or information, would come to the same conclusion. So you've got indicators, possibilities, and reasonable cause. You have the responsibility to dive into that concern and seek assurance or take action to make sure all of those risks are mitigated. In person in position of trust for the NHS, particularly, and for many organisations, what we have to think about is whether the behaviour or the concern is transferable into the role that that person is in. So, for example, if somebody is a perpetrator of domestic abuse and is working in a service where they will encounter victims of domestic abuse, or they may encounter disclosure of domestic abuse, there is a transferable risk into that role because their response to that victim may not be what it should be, given that they perceive perpetration as acceptable. We've got the consideration of expressed views or opinions that could impact of the quality of service provision. So I come back to somebody who has a view of a cultural or a religious view that means that actually they may not respond to somebody in the way they should. They may put a concern down to that's a cultural behaviour that isn't going to impact in role, etc. So you've got to think about what is the worry we have, and does that link to role, and does that then require me to do something about it? You have cases where somebody might outside of work be behaving, so maybe if they're neglecting their own children and there is a response to that, but they're coming into work and having to care for those people that lack capacity, yet they aren't in a caring and nurturing space at home. Is there transferable risk to role? When we're thinking about risk and role, we must also think about other roles that those people may have. So they may work for our organisations, but are they volunteers outside? Is there a need to think about the wider picture of a transferable risk into a different role, even if it's not a risk within the organisation we work with? And how do we look at that, and what agencies do we need to get involved? Assessing and managing risk with PiPOT is one of the most difficult things that we have to do. There are always some challenges, and there may be times when we can't effectively take action. But we must demonstrate that we have considered and assessed all of the possible risks. So when we're talking about risk, we need to consider the risk that the person in position of trust might pose to the person or to an individual. So if we were to take action, might the person in position of trust respond to a service user or to somebody who's blown the whistle? Might there be a punitive reaction? Equally, if we were to take an action whereby removing that person in position of trust from a caring position, from a role within somebody's life, what happens to that person who now has a gap in care provision, who now has a gap in their life where there was somebody there before, somebody they trusted? How do we support them in understanding and being safe and managing and mitigating that risk? I think we must consider, if we were to take action with a person in position of trust, could that impact on them? So do they become a risk to themselves? How do we mitigate that? What's the impact for them if an allegation has been made against them and we are looking at that? Is their mental health being managed? If we're removing them from the workplace temporarily, is that a financial impact? Does the risk then internalise to that person? And do we need to put a wraparound package in for them? And do we need to consider risk to others, the wider risk? Is there a need to triangulate information from wider into the department, the service, the geography that that person works at? What incidents have happened? Where was that person at that time? Do we need to do some wider information gathering? And when thinking about risk to others, we need to consider if the concern that we are acting on, if we take an action, could it increase the risk externally? So in this case, if we were to remove somebody from a role, because again, I go to perpetration of abuse at home, does the risk at home increase? If somebody's not going to be in work for a period of time, that means they're at home more. Is there more risk? Would it be better to keep them at work and manage it separately than them being external where they can't be monitored? So there's thinking about not just our service users or our patients or the people that interact in the workplace, but actually that bigger risk management conversation. We must consider risk to the person in position of trust in the narrative around false allegation. So if somebody, for example, has had an encounter with the police and they are waiting to attend court, and that court appearance might garner some interest from the press, for example, but actually there's no transferable risk to role. However, by being in the media, that might then elicit allegations. Well, that person treated me. Or have you seen that? That person treated me and now I think this. So is it better to consider putting in a support around the person in position of trust while other processes go on, so that we can protect them in the long term. We need to think about the information we're getting, and is it our information? So if we get information, where did it come from? How do we know it? And what can we do with it? Is there a legal basis to share information? Is it our information to know, or do we need to request it through a formal process? So, for example, if you have seen something in the press, do we need to make an approach to our statutory agencies under information sharing with the right GDPR language to say, could you formally share that with us? We need to assess our ability to provide a statutory service, and your information is crucial to that. We need to think about our involvement of professional bodies. And by that, I mean, is the person a professional registrant? Do we need to be informing those? Do we need to be looking at fitness to practice under our professional guidance? Do we need to be flagging it through an independent process if we have a concern about not just professional registration in the NHS, but another statutory agency? What is the correct route to share that information? Say, I think we have a problem. Here is my evidence. So it's looking at making sure we're working within the correct frameworks, policies, processes, and procedures. And when we have to consider making it as difficult as possible, we must consider our legal duty to refer to DBS. We need to be legally literate on understanding when it is we should be referring. So it might be that we have a concern and that person then leaves our organisation or our employment prior to the conclusion of any investigation. We cannot conclude that investigation. They don't work for us anymore. But that risk is still there. We have to transfer the risk. We can't hold it anymore. So who do we tell? And we must consider whether we meet the thresholds for DBS. So whether the person resigns, retires, or leaves before the end of process, and we think the person has carried out one of the following: engaged in relevant conduct. Now, there is a 7-minute guide from the National Safeguarding Network, and it does give you the definition of relevant conduct. Again, let's pick out some really key language here. An action or inaction which endangers, and this is the key bit, or is likely to endanger. So we only have to think that it is a possibility, and that they satisfied the harm test, that they may harm an adult or child or put them at risk of harm. So again, this isn't about, we know this has happened, we've got the evidence that this has happened and you need to know. The DBS will take, we think this has happened, we've got some evidence, there may be a risk, and they will then seek that assurance and review the situation we have. And that is a very quick whistle-stop tour of person in position of trust. I would really like to open the floor to any questions at this point. If anybody would like me to go over anything in more depth, I'm aware that I can go back to my slides if needed. We can talk about any cases, or we can review any of the themes or aspects I brought up today. I've got Claudine.
Hi, thank you. I was just wanting to double check just in relation to DBS referrals. I don't know whether anything has changed, because it was a good couple of years ago, the last time I had a conversation with them in a previous role, and they weren't willing to accept a referral until an investigation had been done that they could then review. Like they weren't willing to accept a referral on this allegation has been made and we're concerned. So I don't know if anything's changed, or whether we know what the what information they need at that point of referral? Not sure if you know.
Yes, so the most recent training has been around, you will have started an investigation even if you've not come to the conclusion of it, but you will have a view based on what you've got as to if this person was still with us, what would we have done? Just because we haven't done it because they have left, it doesn't mean that we wouldn't have a view on, based on the evidence we've got, we would have recommended dismissal, etc. So yes, they do want guidance, but they will then make their own judgment. And I think one of the big things is we've transferred the risk and it's for them to assess. So if we don't tell them, they don't have an ability to say yes or no, we'll take this case. And if we tell them and say there isn't enough, we're not going to do anything, that's the statutory agency decision to make that. It's not for us as an agency to make that on their behalf. We have regional reps for DBS. There's lots of training that we can go on. You can reach into DBS and have case-based conversation. I've had supervision conversations with a regional rep for DBS on the, what do you think? Does this meet your threshold? And they're very responsive, and there's big investment in regional representation. So
that's great. Thank you.
There was a question in chat. I've lost my mouse. Bear with me. Is there a directory of regulatory bodies? You know, when I said Google wasn't going to take off in the 1990s, I tend to now change that view. I don't think there's a published directory of regulatory bodies. You can seek it depending on which one it is. So if you were to identify the organisation and then look at, every organisation will have a complaints process. They will have some kind of regulation linked to it, and we would be able to find out and dive into that. Are there any more questions? Feel free to challenge anything that I've said if you're not sure. Okay, well, in that case, I don't know if Laura is still with us.
I am. Thank you, Louise. That's been a great session, and thank you for giving up your time. I hope everyone's found that really useful. I certainly have. The session has been recorded. We are going to put it on our website, so it will be there to refer back to. And if any other colleagues that haven't been able to attend today, they will be able to access that. But thank you again to everyone for giving up their time, and huge thank you to Louise for putting that together for us. It's been really useful and greatly received, I'm sure. So you've actually got some time back in your diary, so enjoy and make sure you go get some lunch and you have a proper break before you get back to work. But thank you everyone for attending, and hopefully see you all soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.